It started during my senior year at Jefferson High School in a small Midwest town, a school with a history as old as the town itself. They said it was haunted, but no one ever took those stories seriously, at least not until what happened to me. The building had been around since the early 1900s. Most of it had been renovated, but the West Wing, where the old gym, music room, and an unused auditorium sat, remained untouched. Students avoided it as much as possible. The floors creaked like they were alive, the walls bore cracks that resembled angry lightning, and the lights always flickered as if they were too afraid to fully illuminate the space. It was a tradition among the senior class to break into the West Wing before graduation, a dare of sorts. My friends, Amanda, Jake, and Tyler, convinced me to do it one Friday night. "It's just an old building," Amanda had said, her green eyes sparkling with excitement. "What's the worst that could happen?" I wish I'd known the answer. We sneaked in after the janitor locked up for the night. The heavy metal doors groaned as Jake pushed them open, and a blast of cold air greeted us like an uninvited guest. Flashlights in hand, we stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Dust and mildew mixed with something else, something metallic. Blood? I shook the thought away and kept moving, heart pounding in rhythm with my footsteps. "This place gives me the creeps," Tyler muttered, his voice breaking the heavy silence. Amanda laughed. "Don't be a baby." Jake led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. We walked past old classrooms with broken desks and torn chalkboards until we reached the auditorium. It was massive, with rows of decaying wooden seats and a stage draped in tattered red curtains. The air felt heavier here, almost suffocating. "We're here," Jake announced, setting his flashlight down so its beam illuminated the stage. "Now what?" "Let's explore," Amanda said, already climbing onto the stage. I hesitated. Something about the auditorium felt wrong, like we weren't alone. The shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. Then Amanda screamed. We all froze as her flashlight clattered to the floor. She was staring at the curtain, her face pale. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. I thought I saw someone," she stammered, pointing at the curtain. Jake laughed nervously. "It's just your imagination." But as he spoke, the curtain shifted. Not like it had caught a breeze. No, it moved as if something behind it was trying to push through. "Hello?" Tyler called out, his voice echoing. Big mistake. The curtain parted, revealing nothing, at least at first. Then, out of the darkness, came a whisper. "Leave." The voice was low, guttural, and filled with malice. My stomach dropped. Jake grabbed Amanda's arm. "Okay, let's get out of here." We turned to leave, but the doors to the auditorium slammed shut. "What the hell?" Tyler shouted, running to the doors. He pushed and pulled, but they wouldn't budge. "Guys," Amanda whispered, her voice shaking. We turned back toward the stage. The flashlight Jake had left there was flickering, and a figure was forming in its weak light. It was a woman, or at least, it had been once. Her face was pale and sunken, her eyes nothing but black pits. She wore a tattered dress, and her bony fingers clutched a noose around her neck. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice echoing so loudly it felt like the walls were shaking. We ran. The door wouldn't open, but Jake spotted another exit behind the stage. We bolted for it, Tyler and Amanda ahead, Jake and I close behind. As we reached the stage, I felt something grab my ankle. I fell hard, my flashlight rolling away. "Help!" I screamed. Jake turned back, his face pale as he saw what had me. A hand. Pale, cold, and clawed, it was pulling me toward the darkness beneath the stage. Jake grabbed my arms and pulled with all his strength. The hand let go, and I scrambled to my feet. We didn't look back. The door behind the stage opened into a long hallway. We sprinted through it, our footsteps echoing like gunshots. At the end of the hall was another door, this one unlocked. We burst through it and didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for air under the moonlit sky. We tried to tell ourselves it wasn't real. Maybe it was a prank or our minds playing tricks on us. But then Amanda showed us her arm. There were bruises in the shape of fingers. We never spoke about it again, not to each other, not to anyone else. But the nightmares never stopped. Every now and then I dream of that woman. In the dream, I'm back in the auditorium and she's standing on the stage, staring at me with those empty black eyes. And she always whispers the same thing. "You should have listened."
Story number 2.
We called it the Hallway of Whispers. Every school has its urban legends, and at Lincoln High, this was ours. The story went that years ago, a girl named Emily Parker disappeared during detention. Her parents swore she never came home, but no one could explain what happened to her. No body, no evidence, just a mystery that lingered like a bad smell. But the whispers, they started after. It was said that if you stayed late enough, after the janitors locked up and the teachers had gone home, you could hear Emily's voice calling for help. And if you were foolish enough to answer, she'd come for you. I never believed it. Why would I? Ghost stories are just a way for people to scare themselves. Or so I thought. It happened last winter, during finals week. I had stayed late in the library, cramming for a history test I was woefully unprepared for. By the time I realized how late it was, the school was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and headed for the main doors, but as I passed the long corridor leading to the old science wing, I heard it. A faint whisper. "Help me." I froze. The voice was soft, trembling, like a child's. I turned, my heart thudding in my chest. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky. No answer, just silence. I told myself it was my imagination and kept walking, but the whisper came again. "Please, don't leave me." I should have left. I wanted to leave, but something about that voice, it sounded so desperate, so real. Against my better judgment, I turned back and walked toward the science wing. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb at the far end. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the building itself was holding its breath. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a shadow moved across the far end of the hall, darting into one of the classrooms. "Hey!" I shouted, running toward it. I pushed the door open, expecting to find a student or maybe a janitor playing a prank. The room was empty. Desks were neatly aligned, the whiteboard blank, but the whispers didn't stop. "Help me, please." They were louder now, coming from the corner of the room where an old supply closet stood. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity, or maybe something darker, drove me forward. I opened the closet door. Inside, it was pitch black, the kind of darkness that feels alive. My phone's flashlight barely pierced it, but I could see enough. Old textbooks, broken beakers, and a trapdoor. I hesitated. This was crazy. I should have turned around and walked away, but the whisper came again, louder, angrier. "Don't leave me." I lifted the trapdoor. A ladder led down into what looked like an old storage basement. The air was damp and smelled of rot, and the darkness seemed to swallow the light from my phone. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it, soft sobbing, echoing from somewhere deeper in the basement. "Emily?" I whispered, though I didn't believe it could really be her. The sobbing stopped. The silence was suffocating. I turned to climb back up, but then I felt it, cold fingers wrapping around my ankle. I screamed, kicking frantically, but the grip was unrelenting. My phone fell from my hand, clattering to the ground and casting wild beams of light as it spun. "Don't leave me," the voice hissed, but it was no longer soft or desperate. It was angry, venomous. I kicked harder, my foot connecting with something solid. The grip loosened, and I scrambled back up the ladder, slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. I was shaking, gasping for air, but I didn't stop running until I was out of the building. The next day, I told my friends about what happened. They laughed it off, said I'd been studying too hard. But then Amanda, who had been quiet the whole time, said, "I heard her too." We all turned to her. "Last year," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I stayed late after practice. I thought I was alone, but I heard someone crying in the science wing. I went to check it out, but when I got close, I saw her." "Who?" I asked, my throat dry. "Emily," Amanda said. "At least I think it was her. She was standing at the end of the hall, but her face..." She trailed off, her eyes wide with fear. It wasn't human. We never talked about it again after that. But the whispers didn't stop. Weeks later, another student went missing. David Clark, a sophomore, vanished during detention. No one saw him leave, and his backpack was found in the science wing. Now, whenever I walk past that hallway, I feel her eyes on me, watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear her voice. "Don't leave me."
Story number 3.
It was my first year as a teacher at Hawthorne High, and I was still getting used to the quirks of the old building. The school had a long history, one of those places where the stories you hear from locals can send chills down your spine. One of the more infamous tales was about the shadows of room 206. I first heard about it from one of the students, a sophomore named Sarah. She was talking to her friends after class, her voice low and anxious. "Did you hear about room 206? They say that if you're alone in there after hours, the shadows move. They reach for you," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. I laughed it off. "It's just an old building. Don't let it spook you." But She was adamant. "It's real, Mr. Donovan. I know people who've heard things, seen things." The idea seemed ridiculous to me at the time. I wasn't one to indulge in ghost stories, but I couldn't shake the thought of that room. That was a mistake. The first time I found myself in room 206 after hours was completely by accident. I was grading papers late one evening, trying to catch up on work. My classroom was on the opposite side of the hall, but my printer had jammed, and I had to run across the building to retrieve some forms. It was after 6, and the school felt empty, too empty. The overhead lights flickered overhead, casting unsettling shadows on the floor. I walked past room 206 and paused. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to glimpse the rows of old desks and the dusty chalkboard. The room had been unused for years, not assigned to any teacher. It had the kind of neglected air that made it seem as though time had forgotten it. Something compelled me to push the door open further. I don't know why. I wasn't expecting anything. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. The cold. It wasn't a normal kind of chill. It was an oppressive cold, the kind that crawls beneath your skin and settles in your bones. I shivered, reaching for the light switch, but it wouldn't work. The bulbs buzzed and flickered, casting the room in a dim, unreliable glow. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing in the back corner of the room, near the windows. It was just a shadow at first, nothing more than a dark mass. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I could make out the shape of a person. No, a silhouette? A man? A woman? It was impossible to tell. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the silence. No response. The figure didn't move. I stepped back, my mind racing. Maybe it was a student who had snuck in to hang out, or perhaps one of the janitors. But then I noticed something worse. The figure wasn't casting a shadow on the floor. It didn't have a shadow at all. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I stumbled back, suddenly aware of how cold it had gotten. The room seemed to be closing in on me, the walls pressing inward. My breath came faster as panic set in. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard it. A faint sound, like the scraping of fingernails against wood. I froze. The sound came from the corner. I forced myself to look, and what I saw made my heart stop. The shadow was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it was gliding toward me, its shape twisting and shifting like smoke. The figure grew larger, its arms stretching out, reaching for me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted for the door, the air around me thick and heavy like I was wading through water. The room seemed to stretch, the door just out of reach. When I finally burst into the hallway, I slammed the door behind me, gasping for breath. I stood there for a moment, my back pressed against the cold lockers. I had to get out. I had to leave. But then from the other side of the door, I heard a voice. It was soft at first, a whisper barely audible. "Stay." I didn't wait around to hear anything else. I ran straight to the exit, not stopping until I was outside, breathing the cool night air. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. The room had been empty. There had to be an explanation. But the students knew something I didn't. Sarah, the girl from the other day, caught me in the hall between classes. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice serious. "You saw the shadows." I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding crazy. "Did it touch you?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. "No, I don't think so," I replied, feeling an eerie unease creep over me. She nodded, as if that was all she needed to hear. "Then you're lucky. My friend Andy went in there last week. He didn't make it out." I was about to ask her what she meant, but she walked away before I could get another word out. That afternoon, I asked the janitor about the room. He was an old man named Mr. Griffin, someone who had worked at the school for years. "Room 206? He said, his eyes darkening. "No one goes in there. Some things are better left alone." "Why?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "The story goes that a teacher died in that room, years ago. No one knows exactly what happened, but they say she was taken by something in that room. People who go in after dark, they don't come back the same. Some even disappear." My blood ran cold. "Taken by what?" He just shook his head. "I wouldn't be asking questions like that if I were you, Mr. Byhead. Donovan, some things aren't meant to be understood." I left it at that. The next week, I requested to have the room sealed off. I couldn't go back. I didn't want anyone else to experience what I had. But the whispers didn't stop. They never stopped. Some nights, when the school is quiet and the halls are empty, I can still hear them, soft, faint whispers just beyond my door, and I know that room 206 is still there, waiting, filled with shadows.
Story number 4.
It was the night before homecoming, when everything went wrong. I remember it vividly because we were all in high spirits, decorating the gym for the big dance. The cheerleaders were hanging streamers, the football team was goofing off, and my friends and I were in charge of setting up the stage lights. The air was filled with laughter and the faint scent of old varnish from the gym's wooden floor. No one was thinking about the old pool. Harrison High hadn't used its pool in decades. The doors to that section of the building were always locked, and the administration went out of their way to avoid talking about it. It wasn't until I joined the school newspaper that I even learned why. The pool had been drained after an accident. A boy drowned there during a swim meet in 1974. His name was Michael Reed, and he was only 15. His death was ruled an accident, but there were whispers that something else had happened. Something sinister. The story went that Michael's spirit never left. Students who dared sneak into the pool claimed to hear splashes when there was no water, and some swore they saw wet footprints leading nowhere. We all thought it was just a stupid ghost story. Until that night. It was Kyle's idea to break into the pool. He was the class clown, always looking for a way to stir up trouble. "Come on," he said, grinning as he dangled a stolen keyring. "How many people can say they've seen the infamous ghost pool?" "No thanks," I said, but my best friend Mia nudged me. "Don't be such a chicken," she teased. "It'll be fun." Reluctantly, I followed them. Kyle, Mia, and 2 other friends, Rachel and Sam, joined the adventure. The rest of the volunteers stayed in the gym, oblivious to what we were about to unleash. The door to the pool creaked open, revealing a long, dark hallway. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of chlorine and mildew. Kyle led the way, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the cracked tile walls. When we reached the pool, I stopped short. Even after years of disuse, it was massive, stretching out like a dark, yawning chasm. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the deep end gaped like an open mouth. "It's just an empty pool," I said, trying to convince myself as much as anyone else. Kyle hopped onto the diving board, his laugh echoing in the cavernous space. "No ghosts here, just some cowards." Mia rolled her eyes. "Be careful, idiot, that thing's probably not stable." Kyle ignored her, bouncing on the board until it creaked, ominously. That's when we heard it. A splash. It was faint but unmistakable. We all froze, our flashlights sweeping over the empty pool. "What was that?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "Probably just a pipe or something," Kyle said, though his bravado was gone. Then came another splash, louder this time. It echoed through the room and my stomach twisted. "There's no water," Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kyle jumped down from the diving board, his face pale. "All right, joke's over. Let's get out of here." We turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. "Who did that?" Mia shouted, running to the door. She pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, and then we heard it, a faint, wet sound, like footsteps on the tile. "No way," Kyle whispered, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but there was nothing there. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, wet footprints appearing on the tile, one by one, heading straight for us. "Run!" I screamed, but there was nowhere to go. The lights flickered, and for a split second I saw him. A boy, dripping wet, standing at the edge of the deep end. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale and bloated like he'd been underwater for days. "Get out!" the boy said, his voice garbled like it was coming from underwater. Kyle bolted for the far end of the pool, the rest of us scrambling after him. But the sound of splashing water filled the room, and when I looked back, the boy was gone. Instead, the pool was full. What had been an empty chasm moments ago was now brimming with dark, rippling water, and in the center, something was moving. A hand shot out of the water, grabbing Kyle's ankle. He screamed, falling onto the wet tile. "Help me," he shouted, clawing at the floor as he was dragged toward the edge. Mia and I grabbed his arms, pulling with all our strength, but whatever had him was stronger. His screams turned to choking gasps as the water reached for him. Then, he was gone. The pool was empty again. We stood there, panting and shaking, staring at the dry tiles where Kyle had been. "What just happened?" Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We have to get out of here," Sam said, banging on the door. This time, it opened easily. We didn't question it. We ran, not stopping until we were back in the gym, surrounded by bright lights and familiar faces. We tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed us. They thought it was a sick joke that Kyle had run off to scare us, but he didn't come back. The next day, the principal announced that Kyle was missing. Search parties combed the town, but there was no trace of him. A week later, the janitor found Kyle's shoe near the deep end of the pool. After that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those footprints, hearing the splashes, and feeling the icy grip of that hand. I transferred schools before the year ended. Mia and I drifted apart, though I heard she stopped going out after dark. Sam dropped out entirely, and Rachel moved to another state. But sometimes, I still dream of that pool. In my dreams, it's always full, the water dark and still, and from the bottom, Kyle stares up at me, his mouth open in a silent scream, and I know he's not alone.
Story number 5.
I always hated the basement of St. Mary's High School. It wasn't just the way the air smelled damp and musty, or how the flickering fluorescent lights barely chased away the shadows. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. But as the editor of the school newspaper, I had to be in the basement often. That's where the old storage rooms were, crammed with boxes of archived yearbooks, trophies, and forgotten relics from decades past. I'd been there countless times, but it wasn't until the night we stayed late to finalize the homecoming edition that I realized the basement was far more than just unsettling. We were a small team that night. Me, Lisa, our layout designer, and Danny, the photographer. The rest of the staff had left hours earlier. Just need to grab one more box of photos, Lisa said, heading toward the storage room at the far end of the basement. I stayed at the work table, scrolling through article drafts on my laptop. The minutes ticked by. Lisa didn't come back. "Lisa?" I called, my voice echoing in the quiet. No response. I looked at Danny, who shrugged. She probably got distracted. You know how she is with old photos. Still, something felt off. I grabbed a flashlight from the desk and walked toward the storage room. The basement seemed darker than usual. The hum of the lights above me sounded louder, like they were straining to stay on. When I reached the door to the storage room, it was ajar. "Lisa?" I called again, pushing it open. The room was empty, but it felt wrong. The air was colder, heavy with a metallic tang that clung to my tongue. The shelves were lined with dusty boxes and old trophies, their gold plating dulled with age. And then I saw it. A single wet footprint on the floor. "Lisa?" My voice cracked. The footprint was small, like a child's, and it glistened faintly in the weak light. There were no puddles or signs of water anywhere else, just that one footprint. I turned to leave, and that's when I heard it, a faint giggle. It wasn't Lisa's voice, it wasn't Danny's. It sounded like a child. I froze, my heart racing. "Who's there?" No answer, just another giggle, this one closer. I bolted out of the storage room, nearly colliding with Danny in the hallway. "What happened?" he asked, seeing the look on my face. "Lisa's not in there," I said, my voice shaking. "But I heard something." Danny frowned. "What do you mean? Heard something?" Before I could answer, the lights above us flickered violently, plunging us into near darkness. "Lisa?" Danny called, his voice trembling now, and then we heard it, a faint whisper coming from deeper in the basement. "Help me." Danny and I exchanged a look. It was Lisa's voice. "Stay here," Danny said, pulling out his phone and turning on the flashlight. "I'll find her." "No way," I said, gripping his arm. "We're sticking together." We followed the sound of Lisa's voice, our footsteps echoing in the cold, empty space. The whispers grew louder, more desperate. "Help me, please." They led us to a door we'd never seen before, tucked at the end of a narrow hallway. It was made of old, dark wood, its surface scarred with deep scratches. "This wasn't here before," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. The whispers stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the doorknob turned, slowly, creaking as it twisted. Danny and I stepped back, holding our breaths. The door swung open. The room beyond was pitch black, the kind of darkness that felt alive. My flashlight beam barely penetrated it, revealing only a narrow staircase descending into the void. "Lisa?" Danny called, his voice shaky. A faint sob echoed from below. I wanted to run, to leave, and never look back, but something compelled me forward. Maybe it was fear for Lisa, or maybe it was something else entirely. We descended the stairs, the air growing colder with every step. The walls were damp, and the sound of dripping water echoed around us. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a narrow tunnel, the brick walls slick with moisture. And then we saw her. Lisa was standing at the far end of the tunnel, her back to us. "Lisa!" I shouted, relief flooding through me. She didn't turn. "Lisa, we've been looking everywhere for you," Danny said, stepping toward her. As he did, Lisa turned slowly to face us. My relief turned to terror. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her face was pale as chalk. Her mouth was slightly open, but no sound came out. "Lisa?" I whispered. She took a step forward, and that's when we saw them. Figures began to emerge from the darkness behind her, their shapes barely human. Their limbs were too long, their faces featureless. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions like puppets on tangled strings. "Run," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. And then the figures lunged. Danny and I didn't need to be told twice. We turned and bolted up the stairs, the sound of dragging footsteps close behind us. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the staircase impossibly far away. My lungs burned as I ran, the shadows nipping at my heels. When we finally burst through the door and slammed it shut behind us, the basement was silent again. We didn't stop running until we were outside, my gasping for breath under the cold night sky. Lisa never came back. The police searched the basement the next day but found nothing. No door, no tunnel, no trace of Lisa. Danny transferred schools shortly after, and I quit the newspaper. I still dream about that night sometimes. In my dreams, I'm back in the basement, standing in front of that door, and I can hear Lisa's voice, faint and desperate. "Help me." But I know better now, because whatever's down there, it's not Lisa anymore.
Story number 6.
It all started with a dare. Westfield High had its own version of the Bloody Mary legend, but ours was different. We called her the Lady in the Locker. Supposedly, back in the 1970s, a girl named Clara Evans was locked in a gym locker as a cruel prank during homecoming week. The gym was closed for the night and no one heard her screams. By the time they found her the next morning, she was dead. Some said she suffocated. Others whispered that she clawed herself to death trying to escape. The story went that if you stood in the locker room after midnight alone and whispered her name 3 times, you'd hear her scratching on the lockers. If you didn't leave right away, she'd take you too. It was just a dumb story, something the seniors told freshmen to freak them out. Or so I thought. It was the night before homecoming, and my friends and I were in the gym, working late on decorations. The cheerleaders were rehearsing, and the sound of music echoed through the halls. At some point, we decided to take a break. That's when Kyle suggested it. "Let's do the Lady in the Locker," he said, grinning. "No way," I said. "That's just a stupid urban legend." "Exactly," he replied. "So what's the harm? Unless you're scared." I rolled my eyes, but my heart was already racing. I didn't believe in ghosts, but something about the story had always unsettled me. "I'm in," said Mia, smirking. "Let's prove it's fake." Before I could protest, the 4 of us, me, Kyle, Mia, and our friend Sarah, were heading toward the locker room. The gym was eerily quiet now, the sounds of cheer practice long gone. The fluorescent lights in the hallway buzzed faintly, and the smell of sweat and old gym socks clung to the air. When we reached the locker room, Kyle pushed open the door, and it groaned on its hinges. "Ladies first," he said with a mock bow. Mia shoved past him, holding up her phone flashlight. "Let's get this over with." The locker room was cold, colder than it should have been, and the air felt heavier somehow. The rows of lockers stretched endlessly in both directions, their metal doors dented and scuffed from years of use. "All right," Kyle said, grinning as he stepped into the center of the room. "Here's how it works. We stand in front of a locker, say her name 3 times, and wait. Simple. Simple." He turned to me. "You first, Jake." "No thanks," I said quickly. "Fine, I'll do it," Mia said, rolling her eyes. She walked up to an old locker near the back of the room. The door was slightly ajar, the number 53 barely visible under a layer of rust. "Lady in the locker, lady in the locker, lady in the locker," she said confidently. We waited. Nothing happened. "See? Totally fake," Mia said, turning back to us with a triumphant smile. But then we heard it. A faint scratching sound. We all froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. "Stop messing around," Mia said, glaring at Kyle. "I didn't do anything." Kyle hissed, his face pale. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like nails dragging across metal. It was coming from inside the locker. Mia stepped back, her bravado gone. "Okay, joke's over. Let's go." Kyle shook his head. "We have to open it." "Are you insane?" Sarah whispered, clutching my arm, but Kyle was already reaching for the locker door. The scratching stopped. For a moment, the room was silent, the only sound the rapid thud of my heartbeat. Then Kyle yanked the door open. The locker was empty. "See?" he said, laughing nervously. Nothing. Before he could finish, the locker door slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. "Let's get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. We turned to leave, but the locker room lights flickered and went out. plunging us into darkness. "Turn on your flashlights," I shouted, fumbling for my phone. When the lights from our phones illuminated the room, I wished we'd stayed in the dark. The lockers had changed. The once dented and scuffed metal doors were now pristine, gleaming in the dim light. But they weren't empty. Faces pressed against the small vents in the locker doors, their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes were wide with terror, and their hands clawed at the metal from the inside. "What the?" Kyle started, but a loud clang cut him off. A single locker door had swung open at the far end of the room, and she was there, the lady in the locker. She stepped out slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her long, matted hair hung over her face. Her hands were raw and bloody, the nails broken and jagged. She raised her head, and I saw her eyes, dark, empty voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. "Why did you call me?" she whispered, her voice like the scrape of metal against metal. We backed away, but she moved closer, her bare feet leaving bloody smudges on the floor. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm. We bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. "Help me!" Sarah screamed, pounding on the metal. The lady's footsteps echoed behind us, slow and deliberate. Kyle turned, throwing himself at her. "Leave us alone!" he shouted. She grabbed him with inhuman speed, her fingers digging into his arm. He screamed, and I saw blood pouring from where her nails pierced his skin. "Don't look back!" Mia screamed, pulling me toward the emergency exit. This door opened, and we stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. But Kyle wasn't with us. I turned back, but the locker room door slammed shut, and no amount of pulling or pounding could make it budge. The next morning, Kyle's parents called the school. He hadn't come home. The administration claimed he'd run away, but we knew the truth. His name appeared on one of the lockers in the back of the room. Evan, Clara. And beneath her name, a new one had been scratched into the metal. Kyle Morgan. We never went back into the locker room, but every now and then I hear it, the faint sound of scratching like nails dragging across metal, and I know she's still there.
Story number 7.
It was our senior year, and I was finally ready to leave the small town of Glenville behind. But there was one thing I had to do first, something every local teenager dared to try at least once: spend the night in the abandoned Glenville Elementary School. The school had been shut down in the early 80s after a fire gutted most of the building. No one talked much about what happened that day, but there were rumors. Stories about how the fire started in the music room and how the teacher, Mrs. Hargrove, locked the doors to stop the kids from running into the blaze. Except no one ever saw her come out, and some swore they could hear piano music echoing from the ruins at night. I didn't believe the stories, but my friends did. That's how I ended up in the school's charred, crumbling hallways with Jason, Rachel, and Emily on a cold October night. Jason was the one who pushed for it. "Come on, it's tradition," he said, grinning. "We'll bring some snacks, tell ghost stories, and prove we're not afraid of some dusty old school." It sounded harmless enough. We climbed through a broken window just after midnight, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of soot and mildew, and our footsteps echoed on the cracked tile floors. "This place is a dump," Rachel muttered, wrinkling her nose. "Yeah, but it's our dump," Jason said, laughing. "Let's check out the music room." The music room was at the far end of the building, its doorway partially blocked by fallen debris. Inside, the walls were blackened from the fire, and broken music stands littered the floor. In the corner stood an old upright piano, its keys warped and yellowed. "No way that thing still works," Emily said, shining her flashlight on it. Jason walked over and pressed a key. The sound that came out was haunting, a low, warped note that seemed to vibrate through the room. "Creepy," he said, grinning, "but kinda cool." We settled in, spreading out a blanket and opening a bag of chips. For a while, it was just like any other hangout, laughing, joking, and trying to scare each other with ghost stories. But then we heard it, a single piano note. Jason looked up, frowning. "Very funny, guys." "It wasn't me," Emily said, her voice tight. "Not me either," Rachel whispered. We all turned to the piano. Another note played, softer this time, followed by a faint creak like someone shifting their weight. "Okay, let's go," I said, standing up. "Don't be a baby," Jason said, though he didn't sound as confident as before. "It's probably just the wind or something." "The wind doesn't play piano," Rachel hissed. Before we could argue, the piano let out a series of rapid, jumbled notes, as if someone had slammed their hands down on the keys. And then we heard it, a faint hum. It was coming from the hallway, growing louder and closer. "What the hell is that?" Emily whispered, clutching my arm. Jason grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the door. "Let's check it out." "Are you insane?" Rachel said, but Jason was already moving. We followed him into the hallway, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The humming grew louder, turning into a soft, eerie melody. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. "It's a song," I said, my chest tightening. We turned a corner, and that's when we saw her. A woman stood at the end of the hallway, her back to us. She was tall and thin, wearing a tattered dress that looked like it belonged to another era. Her hair was long and dark, hanging in tangled waves down her back. "Hello?" Jason called out, his voice trembling. The woman didn't move. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I said, stepping closer. The humming stopped. She turned her head slowly, and my stomach dropped. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes sunken and rimmed with dark shadows. But her mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin, her teeth bared like she was snarling. We froze, and then she started running. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway, impossibly fast, her twisted grin never faltering. "Run!" Jason shouted, grabbing my arm. We sprinted back toward the music room, our flashlights bouncing wildly. I could hear her behind us, her footsteps pounding on the tile, her voice now a guttural growl. When we reached the music room, we slammed the door shut and piled debris in front of it. My heart was racing, and Emily was sobbing quietly in the corner. "Is she still out there?" Rachel whispered. Jason held his ear to the door, then nodded. "I think she's gone." But then the piano started playing again, slow and deliberate, one note at a time. "Make it stop," Emily whimpered. Jason grabbed a chair and swung it at the piano. The sound of splintering wood filled the room, but the music didn't stop. The notes kept playing, faster and louder, until it felt like the entire room was shaking. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely audible over the noise. Jason kicked aside the debris blocking the door, and we bolted into the hallway. The music followed us, growing louder and more chaotic with every step. When we reached the main entrance, the door was locked. "Break a window!" Rachel shouted, her voice raw with panic. Jason grabbed a piece of debris and smashed it against the glass. It shattered, and we scrambled through, cutting our hands and knees in the process. When we finally made it outside, the music stopped. We stood there, gasping for breath, our faces pale and streaked with sweat. "What the hell was that?" Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. None of us had an answer. The next morning, we told the police everything. They searched the building but found nothing. No woman, no music, and no working piano. But as we were leaving, I glanced back at the school and froze. In one of the broken windows, I saw her, the lady in the music room, staring at me with that same twisted grin.
Story number 8.
The story of the Wilson house was one everyone in our small town knew. It stood on the outskirts, its once beautiful Victorian frame now a decayed skeleton cloaked in ivy and rot. For decades, people swore it was haunted. Strange lights in the windows, shadowy figures, and whispers that carried on the wind when no one was there. I never believed the rumors, not really. But when my older brother Mark dared me to spend the night there, I didn't back down. I wasn't going to let him call me a coward for the rest of my life. "Midnight," Marks said, grinning. "You stay until the first light of dawn. No running, no chickening out." My best friend, Jenny, insisted on coming with me. "If you're dumb enough to do this, someone has to make sure you don't end up dead," she said. So that's how we found ourselves standing in front of the Wilson house at 11:57 p.m., flashlights in hand, and our breaths visible in the chilly October air. The house loomed before us, its windows like hollow eyes, and its front porch sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. "This is stupid," Jenny muttered, kicking at the broken steps. "Let's just say you did it and go home." "You know Mark would never let me live it down," I said, swallowing hard. "Besides, it's just an old house." "Sure," she said. "An old house with a body count." She wasn't wrong. The stories said that, back in the 1920s, the Wilson family had disappeared overnight. A farmer claimed to have seen them walking through the fields toward the woods, their faces blank and eyes wide. They were never found. We stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath our weight. The air smelled like mildew and something else, something faintly metallic, like rust. The living room was cluttered with broken furniture and piles of leaves that had blown in through shattered windows. The wallpaper hung in curling strips, revealing the rotting wood beneath. "Well," Jenny said, her voice shaky but forced, "this isn't so bad." As if in response, a soft creak echoed from the floor above us. I froze. "Probably just the wind." "Sure," Jenny said, gripping her flashlight tighter, the wind walking around upstairs. Let's check it out, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The stairs groaned with every step as we climbed, and our flashlights casting long shadows on the peeling walls. On the second floor, the hallway stretched out before us, lined with doors that led to darkened rooms. Let's just look in one and go back downstairs, Jenny whispered. I nodded, stepping toward the nearest door. It was slightly ajar, revealing a bedroom. The furniture was still there, a bed with a collapsed frame, a dresser missing its drawers, and a mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, a trail of dusty prints leading from the window to the bed. Do you see that? I asked. Shining my flashlight on the floor, Jenny nodded. Who the hell's been in here? Before I could answer, the door slammed shut behind us. Jenny screamed, and I grabbed the doorknob, yanking it open. The hallway was empty, but the sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. Okay, we're done, Jenny said, pulling at my arm. Let's go. We can't, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark will. I don't care about Mark, she snapped. Before we could argue, a low whisper floated through the air. Leave. The word was soft but unmistakable, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Jenny and I bolted for the stairs, but as we reached the top step, the floor beneath us groaned, and then it caved in. I landed hard, the wind knocked out of me as debris rained down around us. Jenny landed beside me, clutching her arm and wincing in pain. We were in the basement. It was colder here, the air damp and suffocating. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of what looked like murky water, their lids rusted and sealed tight. We need to get out of here, Jenny said, her voice shaking. I helped her to her feet, and we began searching for a way out. But the basement seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness swallowing our flashlight beams. That's when we saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the room, its back to us. Who's there? I called, though my voice cracked. The figure didn't move. I shone my flashlight on it, and my heart stopped. It was a man, or what was left of him. His clothes were tattered, his skin gray and sagging, but his head, it was tilted at an impossible angle as if his neck had been broken. And then he turned to face us. His eyes were hollow sockets, his mouth stretched into a gaping, unnatural grin. Jenny screamed, and the figure began to move, its limbs jerking like a puppet on strings. Run! I shouted, pulling her toward the stairs. The figure's footsteps were slow but deliberate, the sound of bare feet slapping against the cold, damp floor. When we reached the stairs, we realized they were gone. The steps we had fallen through had vanished, leaving only a smooth, unbroken wall. There! Jenny shouted, pointing to a small, rusted door at the far end of the basement. We ran for it, the figure's footsteps growing louder behind us. The door was stuck, the metal warped and swollen with age. I threw my weight against it, and it finally gave way, revealing a narrow tunnel. We scrambled inside, crawling on our hands and knees as the figure's guttural growls echoed behind us. The tunnel twisted and turned, the air growing colder with every inch. Finally, we saw a faint light ahead. We crawled faster, bursting out into the night air and collapsing on the ground. When we looked back, the tunnel entrance was gone. The Wilson house loomed in the distance, its dark windows watching us like eyes. We never told anyone what happened that night. But sometimes when I pass the edge of town, I hear whispers carried on the wind, and I know the Wilson house is waiting.